The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time. Welcome to today's hearing entitled Establishing an Independent NOAA. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Good morning. Today's hearing focuses on a topic of great importance to this committee, the future of NOAA, its mission, and its place within the executive branch. NOAA is one of the most important agencies within our committee's jurisdiction. Its role in forecasting weather, which protects lives and property, cannot be understated. And its cutting-edge research helps us better understand our planet and our climate, allowing us to make sustainable use of our country's tremendous natural resources. However, despite the importance of this work, NOAA has a curious origin that has prevented the agency from reaching its full potential. The agency was created by executive order under President Richard Nixon in 1970, without Congress ever formally authorizing the agency's existence. The best location for NOAA was the subject of a debate, with some arguing that it should be placed within the Department of Interior, others suggesting it be created as an independent agency within the executive branch. Ultimately, the President chose to combine several prior existing administrations, bureaus, and agencies into a single entity under the Department of Commerce. In the intervening years, NOAA's responsibilities and budgets have grown, while the debate about its proper home has continued with no widely accepted solution. NOAA exists through a patchwork of roughly 200 statutes that have resulted in an agency with complex organizational challenges and, at times, an ill-defined mission. This can be frustrating for NOAA and its employees, as well as stakeholders who rely on the work and Congress as we attempt to provide oversight and legislation. I unveiled the draft bill in December, which would provide authorizing legislation, more commonly known as an Organic Act, for NOAA. This relatively short bill, only 22 pages long, yes, I said 22 pages long, would provide a framework for NOAA to be formally established as an independent agency within the executive branch. It would elevate NOAA within the executive branch to an appropriate level alongside similar science agencies like NASA and the National Science Foundation. This legislation would clearly state NOAA's important mission in statute. At the same time, the bill would provide a clear slate for NOAA to reorganize and streamline its operations, helping it to adopt and reset in a modern structure. As a part of this reorganization, the Office of Space Commerce would be taken out of NOAA and given greater standing within the Department of Commerce. Commercial space is a rapidly developing industry that will be a key component in the evolution of American competitiveness. It deserves the focus and leadership that can come from raising its profile within commerce. Importantly, this bill will provide the opportunity for greater accountability by allowing Congress to engage in a level of oversight which has not been possible due to NOAA's unwieldy structure. This lack of cohesive direction has prevented us from examining the agency as a whole and has forced Congress to authorize its activities on a piecemeal basis. I understand that the decision to elevate NOAA to an independent agency within the executive branch has drawn a fair bit of attention. However, my belief is that NOAA's mission and its important role in research and development warrant a placement outside of the Department of Commerce, where oftentimes the agency can be considered an afterthought in the department's activities. In short, this bill streamlines NOAA's operations. It makes it easier to carry out critical environmental research and weather forecasting. It makes their operations more transparent to Congress and the public, and it enables NOAA to be a modern, flexible government agency that provides accurate, timely, impactful services to Americans. For more reasons than one, the time is right for this legislation. Today's witnesses, each former NOAA administrator, represent a range of experiences at the agency and can provide firsthand insight into NOAA's operations and how an Organic Act can support this mission. They, better than anyone, can give us firsthand accounts of what it's like to run a scientific agency while dealing with NOAA's unique organizational challenges. I encourage all my colleagues to listen closely as they point out the difficulties they faced and how an Organic Act can avoid these problems in the future. I look forward to working with the ranking member, my colleagues, and the committees, other committees as we move forward with this process. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time, and I now recognize the ranking member, the gentlewoman from California, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Lucas, for holding this important hearing, and thanks to the witnesses for your testimony. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, better known as NOAA, is an important scientific agency that provides services to help prepare and protect life and property from severe weather and climate events. NOAA is also an important research agency for furthering the understanding of the Earth system and its interplay with climate, weather, coasts, oceans, and other ecosystems. NOAA's products and services are used by all Americans in some manner every day, whether they know it or not. This agency supports the economic health of our country and is estimated to affect more than 1/3 of America's gross domestic product. These are just a few of the reasons why we should continue and even strengthen our support of NOAA. An Organic Act mentioned by the chairman would formally establish NOAA and codify its overarching mission. Congress has attempted to pass a NOAA Organic Act over a dozen times since its establishment by executive order in the 70s. The idea of a NOAA Organic Act has long had bipartisan support. However, differences over the scope and details of what such an act would include derailed previous efforts to pass legislation. Now, we have a fractious political environment, but I am eager to work with the chairman and my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to elevate NOAA in the public discourse and see what we can achieve. And I am mindful that this committee's long history of bipartisanship may help us avoid the pitfalls of prior years. In the chairman's draft legislation, as he mentioned, NOAA will become an independent agency. NOAA currently makes up more than half of the department's budget, and that would be a major reorganization that requires input, not only from our colleagues on other committees, but also the Secretary of Commerce and the President, as well as external stakeholders. All the witnesses today support an independent NOAA, and I look forward to hearing from them how they formed their views and how the overall mission of NOAA would be affected by making it independent. It's important to get an understanding of the pros and cons of such a shift, and it's important to get a variety of perspectives on the question of it, of independence, as well as other key elements of the proposed act. I appreciate the chairman's effort to include a former administrator appointed by a Democratic president, but none of these witnesses oppose an independent agency. Given the significance of this legislation, I've asked the majority to have another hearing that would provide a perspective from those who have a different point of view so that we can balance all viewpoints as we move forward. With that said, I thank Mr. Lucas for his willingness, as always, to work with us in a bipartisan basis. The draft we're discussing is a very good start and already reflects some bipartisan discussions at the staff level. I commit to continuing to work with the chairman on this. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back, and as always, I appreciate her thoughtful comments. With that, our first witness today is Vice Admiral Conrad Luttenbacher, who was the NOAA administrator during the entirety of the George W. Bush administration from 2001 to 2008. Our second witness is Rear Admiral Tim Gallaudet, who was the acting administrator from 2017 to 2019. And our final witness is Dr. Neil Jacobs, who was the acting NOAA administrator from 2019 to 2021. All of our witnesses are extremely accomplished, but also share the honor of having led NOAA at one point or another. So welcome all of you, and thank you for being here today. I now recognize Dr. Luttenbacher for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the opportunity that I have today and that we all have today. And Chairman Lucas, Ranking Member Lofgren, and members of the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. I very much appreciate this opportunity to be part of this hearing regarding NOAA's future. As background, I served as Undersecretary of Commerce for NOAA for Oceans and Atmosphere from 2001 and 2008, as mentioned, a position which included being NOAA administrator. So I had a title and I had, that particular thing. Furthermore, a few years after leaving NOAA, I joined GeoOptics, a commercial satellite provider of radio occultation data and Earth and space weather observation data. With the support of Congressman Lucas, Congresswoman Bonamici, former Congressman Bridenstine, and many other members of this committee, GeoOptics advocated for NOAA to be able to purchase commercial satellite data. With your leadership, this was included in the Weather Research and Forecasting Innovation Act that I understand is up for reauthorization this year, to which I'm very grateful. Commercial weather data purchases are, I am proud to say, serving NOAA's observational requirements, and I am, for the record, currently GeoOptics Executive Chairman. It's my position. It's also a great pleasure to be present today with Tim Gallaudet, Rear Admiral USN retired, and Dr. Neil Jacobs, who both recently served as NOAA administrators. We are here, as mentioned, to discuss the future of NOAA, formed within the Department of Commerce in 1970 without a congressionally approved Organic Act. Some of you may remember when I was NOAA administrator, securing congressional passage of an Organic Act for NOAA was one of my highest priorities. 17 years ago, I testified before this community, seems like only yesterday, and then thanked Chairman Sherman Bullitt and Ranking Member Bart Gordon and told them how much I truly appreciated the bipartisan manner in which they conducted the Science Committee and their strong support of NOAA. That famous legacy has continued within this committee through the years. I thank them for their leadership and recognized Congressman Vern Ehlers for his leadership efforts to pass an organic NOAA Act on the House floor. Sadly, it failed to advance that year, but I am back again to press you on this need one more time. Thank you. The establishment of current major parts of NOAA can be traced back to the 1800s. This is not just something that happened yesterday. And include the Weather Bureau in 1870, the Fisheries Commission in 1871, and the Survey of the Coast Office in 1807 by President Thomas Jefferson. As such, NOAA is the oldest science-based agency in the United States. Please note that I was honored to serve with the highly dedicated NOAA workforce during my tenure, and of note, along with the two colleagues next to me and every other NOAA leader, we witnessed a host of great achievements for the global community as well as the American people. One of those achievements is that NOAA remains a world leader in atmospheric and ocean science. Remember that more than 70% of our planet is covered by the ocean. What happens to the oceans and atmosphere vastly affects what happens around the entire globe, not only the United States. The current administrator, Dr. Rick Spinrad, who worked for me, leads an equally dedicated and hardworking team of NOAA employees. They are tackling many new oceanic and atmospheric challenges, from the blue economy to the northwest salmon stocks to increased storm impacts, which we've all seen recently. NOAA continues to meet the challenges posed by atmospheric rivers, droughts, heat waves, increased wildfires, and space weather impacts, particularly space weather these days, to dealing with the ravages of climate change, managing the future of American aquaculture, to restoring coral reefs, to protecting national marine monuments and the new GeoXO satellite. An independent NOAA is needed to address current and future challenges without an antiquated, tethered relationship with the Department of Commerce. From the sun to the ocean depths, NOAA is needed to provide the scientific understanding and action for the increased problems we face and to secure our planet's future. My grateful thanks again to Chairman Lucas for scheduling this hearing. In closing, I urge your consideration and support to establish NOAA as a separate and independent scientific research and development and action agency. Thank you for your consideration. I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Doctor. I now recognize Dr. Gallaudet for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Chairman Lucas, Ranking Member Lofgren, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today regarding the NOAA Organic Act. Having served as the acting and deputy NOAA administrator, I witnessed firsthand the world-class science, service, and stewardship of America's leading ocean, weather, and environmental agency. NOAA's team of top-notch scientists, staff, uniformed officers, and contractors positively impact every American life every day through life-saving weather and water warnings. NOAA is also a leader in advancing America's growing blue economy through management of our nation's fisheries, updates to the nautical charts of our exclusive economic zone, precision navigation data for U.S. seaports, and supports coastal tourism and recreation, as well as mapping and exploring our oceans, coasts, and Great Lakes. I wish to thank the committee for supporting NOAA and you, Chairman Lucas, for your leadership in drafting a bill to make NOAA an independent agency, which I support for two primary reasons. The first concerns NOAA's budget, which comprises over half of that of the Department of Commerce. This past year, millions of dollars of the agency's portfolio were once again transferred to the Commerce Department's Working Capital Fund for Shared Services. The department's own Inspector General found the program to have weaknesses, yet Commerce is moving forward this year with a massive $353 million consolidation of its agency's budget and grant management functions that have already experienced numerous delays and cost overruns. Commerce's egregious extraction of NOAA funding is most evident when the department falls short on its funding for the decennial census. Costs for the 2020 census were over $3 billion above initial estimates, while the unreliable cost assessments of the 2010 census ultimately caused Commerce to send a last-minute congressional request to reprogram funds to fill the gap. In these instances, the Commerce Department reallocated NOAA funding to the Census Bureau, and the only way NOAA could cope with such high budget cuts was to delay critical upgrades to environmental satellites and other major programs. The second reason to make NOAA independent concerns management. Paying the Department of Commerce to ineptly duplicate NOAA's own management system makes no business sense. A central problem is the lack of shared priorities between the two layers of government, which has produced chronic conflict with NOAA on the receiving end of poorly crafted and sometimes damaging decisions. There are two lenses through which I see the benefits of making NOAA independent. The first is the impact on NOAA's weather and climate services, where I see at least two positive results. First, stabilizing the management and budget of NOAA's satellite programs by eliminating the aforementioned cuts from the Commerce Department. This will support the myriad of NOAA functions using satellite data, such as the Earth Prediction Innovation Center, which we initiated during the last administration to regain American leadership in weather modeling. Second, accelerating the influx of innovation from the private sector. During my tenure with NOAA, we initiated data and technology partnerships with leading innovators in the private sector to modernize NOAA's weather, satellite, and data capabilities in the same way that SpaceX is assisting NASA. Erratic and inconsistent budget profiles do not inspire confidence in industry, and an independent NOAA will more effectively advance initiatives like these. The other lens through which I see the benefits of making NOAA independent is the agency's maritime missions. Less is known about the world's oceans than the surfaces of the Moon and Mars. This is concerning because the marine environment is as important, if not more than space, in the everyday lives of American citizens. The ocean is a critical conduit for global supply chains, the dominant domain of our great power competition with China, and a growing source of economic security through commercial fishing and offshore energy. NOAA is America's top ocean agency, and making it independent will have at least two important maritime-related impacts. First, it will expand our understanding of America's oceans. While I was with NOAA, we initiated and oversaw the development of the National Ocean Mapping, Exploration, and Characterization Strategy and Implementation Plan. NOAA will be even more effective in leading this effort if the agency's leadership is freed from the everyday deluge of distracting data calls and analysis requested by the Commerce Department. Secondly, Chairman Lucas's bill will accelerate the recovery of America's imperiled marine species. Because protection of the endangered species and marine mammals is split between NOAA and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which manages over 90% of the species, Chairman Lucas's draft bill directs a feasibility study on combining them. I recommend, however, to modify the legislation to move NOAA's protected species responsibilities to the Fish and Wildlife Service outright. In summary, NOAA is not a good fit in the Commerce Department due to the disparate goals of the department and its largest subordinate agency. They have had a demonstrably adverse impact on NOAA's budget and management. An independent NOAA will not only ensure that America can better weather future storms, but it will also put NOAA's ocean missions on par with those of NASA for space, and therefore more effectively address the dominant role of the maritime domain in America's natural, national, and economic security. Thank you for supporting NOAA. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Doctor. I now recognize Dr. Jacobs for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Chairman Lucas, Ranking Member Lofgren, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify at this hearing on a topic that is not only near and dear to me, but also important for the future of our country's scientific leadership. NOAA has a unique mission that spans the ocean floor to the surface of the sun. They're entrusted with the responsibility to provide critical information to the public that enables informed decisions on a wide range of phenomena spanning a broad spectrum of temporal and spatial scales. It was a tremendous honor to help lead such a distinguished organization of scientists and engineers, forecasters, and uniformed officers. While at NOAA, I developed a deep appreciation for the dedication and professionalism of the entire workforce, from issuing life-saving forecasts to complex weather events, managing fish stocks, mapping our coast, and launching satellites into space. Their dedication to the mission is unparalleled across government. NOAA's mission impacts every American every day. While the services NOAA provides arguably offer the greatest return on taxpayer investment, it is stunning to know that the agency was created by an executive order and has never been officially authorized by Congress. Because NOAA has such a diverse set of mission requirements, where it should exist or whether it should retain its existing structure has been an ongoing discussion. There are valid arguments across the spectrum regarding what it should look like, but one thing I believe we can all agree on is that NOAA needs an Organic Act. When it comes to an Organic Act that creates an independent NOAA, there are some trade-offs that Congress should consider. Having a secretary-level position promoting NOAA equities does have some advantages. A secretary can communicate and amplify NOAA's mission and priorities to a wider audience. However, this assumes that the department's priorities are aligned with NOAA's mission, and that's not often the case. Likewise, balancing budget priorities across all the bureaus in DOC has always been a challenge for NOAA. Trade-offs aside, there are many significant distinct advantages. The ability to effectively map budget decisions to agency priorities is a crucial aspect of meeting mission requirements. This may sound obvious, but the current structure results in the process inconsistent with this goal. Having the freedom and flexibility to communicate is critical for success. That is not unique to a science agency or even the public sector. Communication is a fundamental tenet of all aspects of leadership. Additional layers of approval and clearance, while well-intended, often inhibit leadership's ability to connect with the employees carrying out the public service mission. Likewise, the pride of knowing your agency will receive the recognition it deserves for the critical services it provides cannot be emphasized enough. This is largely related to the lack of branding. NOAA is often compared to NASA during interagency coordinations, but the public does not see it that way. Most everyone has heard of the National Weather Service, yet not many people know it's part of NOAA. And they're even more surprised to learn that NOAA is part of Department of Commerce. Up until the most recent paint jobs on the NOAA Hurricane Hunters, the planes were doing hurricane awareness tours with giant words painted on the side that read, U.S. Department of Commerce. While there may be some benefits to being in DOC, branding and name recognition will remain a challenge as NOAA will continue to struggle to establish an identity apart from Department of Commerce. This may seem like a trivial issue, but in my opinion, it's the single most important thing driving NOAA's future budgets and workforce recruitment. Lastly, transparent, objective, and defendable science requires autonomy. While tight budgets combined with changing priorities will always play a role in any organization, the additional layers of bureaucracy in the current structure often do not add value to the scientific aspect of NOAA's mission. I commend Chairman Lucas for taking on this long-standing issue. I would also like to thank the committee for their bipartisan support of NOAA. Finally, I would like to thank all the amazing employees of NOAA and the wonderful service they provide to the American people. It was truly a privilege to work for them. Chairman Lucas, Ranking Member Lofgren, and members of the committee, thank you again for inviting me to participate today. I'd be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Doctor, and I again thank the witnesses for your testimony, and the chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. It should be apparent now that we've done our homework and a tremendous amount of historical research when drafting this NOAA Organic Act. One sentiment that resonated through this process was that throughout history, even the very best Secretary of Commerce has rarely been personally invested in NOAA's issues or even its success. So I want to ask each of you, during your time as administrator, what, if any, benefits did you and the entire NOAA have from being under the Department of Commerce's umbrella? And while you're thinking about that, The follow-up will be, would you say there is more potential downside than benefit to being housed within DOC? And whoever would care to answer first. You're the senior man with wisdom there, Doctor, so you get the call.
Yes, sir. I believe that we should do, as has been suggested, to have an independent agency to do this and do it under. And I'm not locked into. There are things that are possible in the government to pass and things that are not possible. So you want to work for something that you can get and that's going to make a difference. So I think it's really critical that we have some kind of a list of things they do, and you know what they are, and that the budgets can meet that. And that's where I am on this. I think that's a really critical thing for us to do, and I appreciate all the work that's been done to try to reach that point. And I see that as a great benefit to the nation, as well as the operation of commerce and the operation of NOAA. I think that kind of that kind of change would be very, very important.
Dr. Gallaudet?
Chairman Lucas, I'd be hard-pressed to find any benefits of having NOAA under the Department of Commerce, and I can give you at least one example of where that impeded our progress. In May of 2020, the White House released an executive order 13-921 on promoting seafood competitiveness and economic growth. That was an effort that NOAA initiated and took 2 years to get through the department. And we could have done that at least a year earlier, and it's advancing NOAA fisheries in a pretty significant way right now with aquaculture opportunity zones. And again, it was delayed and actually stalled for some period due to the Commerce Department not really understanding and taking the due diligence to do that.
Dr. Jacobs?
I can think of one instance where the Secretary did support me on the 5G issue with the 24 gigahertz interference, but the downside list would be pretty extensive. I'll have to submit that afterwards because it's quite long.
Fair enough. I know each of you, while at the head of NOAA, had to deal with reorganization and restructuring plans from higher powers. As written, do you think this draft, this Organic Act, encourages cutting, eliminating, or repurposing any of the critical functions or offices that are currently carried out by NOAA? Because I do no harm here when I can.
Chairman Lucas, I believe your bill does a great job in preserving the mission for NOAA, and I don't see any risk or harm. And in fact, as my statement said, I think it would be good to move the protected species functions out of the agency and create more efficiency in government for those functions.
I don't see any issues either. In fact, I think having it sitting out there under an executive order is more risky.
And I'll finish that up with one last, coming at this from a slightly different angle. Do you have any concerns this legislation would lead to the agency being carved up?
No.
No concerns, Chairman.
I honestly haven't had a chance to go through the whole thing, but I support my colleagues.
We'll get you a
here
copy.
today. Okay, get me a copy, but I'd be delighted to see the whole thing.
In the final seconds I have, as noted in my statement, NOAA's current structure is governed by more than 200 individual laws. Setting aside the issue of where NOAA should be placed within the executive branch, can you explain to the committee, anyone who take this on, how having an Organic Act would allow better congressional oversight and more efficient management for future administrations?
Chairman Lucas, I think 200 laws compared to one is not a good use of government, so I think better housekeeping in Congress's is in Congress's interest. But also, every one of those laws requires some kind of periodic reporting to Congress, which requires a lot of staff hours on NOAA and the Department of Commerce that could be reduced or even eliminated.
Before you yield back, I would note the ranking member and I have a long history of doing things that seem impossible and are extremely difficult. So the challenge is engaged. With that, I yield back and recognize the ranking member for her questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Quick question. If NOAA becomes an independent agency, its budget would be relatively small compared to other independent agencies. NSF has a budget of nearly $10 billion. NASA has a budget of more than $27 billion. How would NOAA fare in the appropriations process here in Congress relative to the other independent agencies? Do you have a concern that if it's an independent agency as compared to being part of the Department of Commerce might have a little more heft, that we might not do well in the appropriations process?
Thank you, Congressman Lofgren. I believe that if NOAA were independent, as I said, it would not suffer budget cuts that Congress has heretofore made repeatedly. And additionally, I think the agency would be able to be on stronger ground to find efficiencies across government and possibly boost its budget. I see U.S. Geological Service has coastal programs that are science programs that are redundant with NOAA's and should be consolidated with, I think, in NOAA's in America's top ocean agency. Same goes for the climate modeling and Department of Energy and some of the Earth observation missions in NASA.
That spurs a follow-up question, because if you talk to other agencies that could be duplicative, USGS will argue strongly that they have the expertise for what they do as compared to NOAA. So what would be anybody's reaction to that? This is a massive change, and change is not easy.
So NOAA, ma'am, is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and USGS is the U.S. Geological Survey. And so I see many USGS scientists with marine biologists in their title. So to me, there's a disconnect.
As I mentioned earlier, it's good to hear from people who support an independent agency, but I think we need to hear from people who might not. You know, the chairman and I are working in good faith to do the best thing for our country, but we want to be aware of all of the entanglements that might arise. On that point, whether we give NOAA independence or not, some argue that, I'm not suggesting that the chairman's proposal does this, but some are concerned that legislation that is too prescriptive would diminish NOAA's ability to pursue new programs or mission areas. And, you know, not suggesting the chairman's draft does that, but there's efforts in the Senate, there'll be amendments and the like. What would you be concerned about in that area, any of you, that would hinder the capacity of NOAA to take on new missions as events change?
I think the less prescriptive, the better. But there's so many other authorizations out there for NOAA mission requirements that are fairly prescriptive already. You know, consolidating those, but giving NOAA the flexibility and autonomy to make the decisions on how they execute their mission would be ideal.
Finally, let me just ask this for whoever might be able to answer it. We've had, I mean, tremendous severe weather events recently. I believe, and most of us do, that they are connected to climate change. Obviously, these extreme weather events are not just stopping at our borders. Last year, there were $42 billion weather disasters with damage totaling more than $360 billion globally. Foreign nations had their most expensive weather disasters on record. How would making NOAA independent affect its relationships with foreign countries and allies, from the leadership down to the individual scientist level? How would it enhance or detract from collaboration?
Thank you for your question, Ranking Member Lofgren. I think that NOAA is the gold standard in terms of science, in terms of prediction research for the extreme events you talk about, and we have proven international partnerships for decades. And I think having an independent NOAA would reinforce those and strengthen them, because they would not have to be required to do the mother may I communication, which is near constant for those kinds of programs and partnerships to the Department of Commerce.
Thank you very much.
I was going to say, we are very connected to the same agencies that mirror us around the world. And the world is at 70% is ocean.
Yeah.
And the rest of it, where we are, is an island with a bunch of hills that go up and down, and you get incredible kinds of, we have the worst of the world, basically, if you go and look at the way it's going. So we are very well connected, and we're leaders in this area, and we want to stay leaders because it makes sense to us. We have populations that are living in this and are going to have to continue to live. Look at the water that came into Florida just recently.
Or my district in Pajaro.
Right.
I see
Thank
my
you.
time is up, and so I yield back.
Thank you, and I'd like to now recognize Mr. Posey from Florida.
Thank you, Chairman. Could you please, Dr. Jacobs, speak to how additional layers of bureaucracy have led or could lead to avoidable program delays and funding reallocations for the GOXO program and the NEON program, for example?
Well, in the past, I mean, this is nothing new. We've got IMPOS, JPSS, the GOZAR series. All these had cost overruns, delays, and mismanagement, in part primarily because of the additional layers of bureaucracy. And on top of that, other agencies adding more mission requirements to the NOAA program.
Yeah, how can we learn from the past to better ensure that both GOXO and NEON remain on schedule?
I think the key is providing operational mission requirements and also in addition to that, relying more heavily on the commercial sector to supplement the government backbone.
Okay, thank you. To each of the panelists, how will stakeholders be able to appeal decisions by NOAA? You know, will stakeholders that have a concern with a decision need to appeal to the White House, for example?
Congressman Posey, thank you for your question. I believe NOAA has in place already very healthy relationships with stakeholders across every mission set, from satellite operations to coral reef conservation, and having an independent NOAA would, again, only reinforce and allow those to become stronger.
Yeah, let me second that. NOAA has spent a lot of time connecting with the people around and that go with us, so to speak, and need us, and we need them. And I don't see that ever changing. So I think that's going to, well, if it doesn't, we ought to replace the head of NOAA if that's not going on, because that has been the rule. Thank you.
I would agree with my colleagues.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, and now I'd like to recognize the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Stevens.
Thank you. Gentlemen, we have something in common, which is we all worked at the Department of Commerce. I was in the Economic Development Administration and never really had the chance to get over to NOAA, but have obviously studied the agency's work and really respect the conversation we're having here today. It's one that's sort of difficult, right? How do we reform government to function better? You look at the origin of NOAA, executive order adopted by Congress, wasn't really congressional law. Under Nixon, who created the EPA, who created OSHA, and I've gone back and studied why and how in the 1970s we were creating all these federal agencies. This notion of good governance, streamlining the taxpayer dollar to better serve the taxpayer. So I really want to applaud our chair and our ranking member for bringing us here today to have this discussion. And I know we tried to make it more bipartisan. I know there's other NOAA administrators who maybe would have liked to be here alongside you that could inform this. It appears to me that there's duplication going on. And I'd like to ask you all about that duplication. I come from Michigan. I got water, we got fresh water, but scratching my head, does NOAA have any oversight of our Great Lakes? And I believe the answer is no. But perhaps the second question is, should it?
I'll take that question, Congresswoman Stevens.
Thank you.
Thank you for your leadership here, and absolutely yes is the answer. I encourage you to delve into the many NOAA programs that oversee and touch the Great Lakes, that manage and conserve the waters to keep the water quality good. In fact, the highlight of, I think, NOAA's presence in the Great Lakes, there too, is The Great Lakes Research Lab, GLRL,
Is in NOAA.
it's NOAA's lab and it's in your state.
But you're working also in coordination with EPA.
Yes, ma'am.
Because, I mean, some of this is interagency. And so when we start to look at duplication, right, and we can look at this with the species, we have this cited in the committee documents, the freshwater salmon versus the saltwater salmon. We need to have a conversation about water, right? And it's great that NOAA has this Great Lakes entity. I've traditionally worked with the EPA. But how would creating a separate NOAA agency then make it such that we could better serve our Great Lakes or avoid some of the duplication that exists in the federal government?
Woman Stevens, I think that there's a healthy presence of NOAA in the Great Lakes doing non-duplicative work. For example, you have a national marine sanctuary called the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary in Alpena, Michigan, or off Alpena, Michigan, which conserves over 100 historic shipwrecks. And that's an important entity also for public outreach and education. And it's a world mecca for scuba dive tourism. In fact, so there's things that NOAA is doing in the Great Lakes, great work, that it isn't repetitive or duplicative. Now, granted, there are some things like that, and this bill is addressing the one with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But I think it would be helpful for you to visit the Great Lakes Research Lab and the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary to understand the good work that's happening there.
Yeah, we want to elevate that. And maybe it's, you know, as we look at this legislation and this opportunity for NOAA, potentially we look at rebranding, right? Because we see this, you know, we were digging around on this. I knew there were some little touch points over here, but we need to have more interaction with an entity like NOAA and for those of us who are members of, you know, the Great Lakes region, because it's not being elevated. And when we're looking at species, and we've had this conversation here about the carp that's coming in, it's the intersection is not occurring. And so how do we better, you know, work across government or elevate the work of NOAA? And potentially that is taking it out of an agency that is traditionally focused on commerce and moving it towards it's a bigger focus that would be, and I know others of you probably want to chime in, but scratching at this, I think, might yield some better results.
I couldn't agree more with what you're saying. I really think that NOAA is facing a big marketing and branding challenge. A lot of people don't know what NOAA is. They know what the Hurricane Center is. They know what the Weather Service is. They know what the Department of Commerce is. They have no idea what NOAA is. And that's a challenge. I mean, I can tell you a story that Administrator Bridenstine, when he was at NASA, actually found out that my 7-year-old wore a NASA T-shirt to school and was laughing at me because I was ahead of NOAA.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. And I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, and now I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got some weather-related questions for you. Just for this, I guess all three. We held a hearing last month that focused on the private sector's involvement in NOAA National Weather Service. We've talked about that. Question is, how can we direct NOAA to better identify and resolve potential conflicts or competition between the private and the government activities? And I want the nexus to be here. I want the focus to be specifically, I'm from the Gulf Coast of Texas. We've been known to have a little storm, or two on the Gulf Coast. Specifically with hurricanes in mind, what part will NOAA play in being that liaison, if you will, between private and government activities when there's a hurricane out there? Dr. Lautenbacher, we'll start with you.
Yes, sir. You're absolutely correct in terms of the ability to be able to deal with the hurricanes that we have. And I would say this is a question of ensuring that we have the right connections set up. Again, I'm not the current head of NOAA, so I don't know exactly.
Have you experienced problems when you were there?
I didn't have those problems when I was there. Okay. I would get up in the airplane and we'd go and look, when we were flying through the hurricanes, I would be up there for several of them, and I would come back and look at, with my folks, what's happened and what we could do. So I'm a strong believer in working together along with the states and particularly along the ocean coastline, that NOAA and the states need to have that connection. And if we can make that stronger in assigning what NOAA should be doing to help the
Predicting.
yeah, what you've just mentioned, I think it's important, and that should be an important part of what we say when we build that Organic Act or something that says.
Right. I get that. Dr. Tim G., we'll go to you.
Congressman Weber, great question, and I think a lot of good work is happening already with NOAA partnering in the private sector. I happen to be an advisor to a company called Tomorrow.io, who has signed a cooperative research and development agreement with NOAA to assimilate data from their new satellite constellation into the hurricane models, for example, to improve their accuracy for track and intensity. And then there's another company I also work with called So Far Ocean, has a global network of data buoys that NOAA also is working with a cooperative research and development agreement to do the same thing, but assimilating the buoy data instead of satellite data. So NOAA's moving out on this, and thanks to this committee's support for the Weather Research and Forecasting Innovation Act, that's really enabled great progress.
Dr. Jacobs.
I would just add that there's a tremendous amount of potential in the commercial sector for public-private partnerships with acquiring observations. That's what we use to initialize the forecast models, even the hurricane models. And then on top of that, I would like to mention that the Fair Weather Report turns 20 years old this year, and this was looking at the roles of the public sector versus the private sector. And the Weather, Water, Climate enterprise has evolved so far in this 20 years. I think it's probably time to revisit this and see what are the capabilities on offer in the private sector, and how can we sort of readjust the public-private academic partnerships.
All right, I'm going to go to a different subject now. We talked earlier about improving satellites. I think there was some stress between NOAA and the Department of Commerce in somebody's comments earlier. Is NOAA's satellite system up to snuff? We'll start back with you, Dr. Jacobs, and go this way.
It's an ongoing challenge. I mean, it's always, when NOAA has to deal with Department of Commerce, it's always competing budget priorities. And a lot of what could be put into the satellite programs may end up going to support other priorities across the Department of Commerce. I would like to point out that I think the satellite capability and the instrument capability itself far exceeds NOAA's ability to use and extract value from the data. This is normally a shocking number, but only a couple of % of the data that's actually collected is used in the models. And that's largely just because the files are very large, they need a lot of processing. So I think the biggest return on investment for optimizing the usage of the satellite data is actually with AI or edge computing on orbit, a lot of capabilities where you're not necessarily focused on a better instrument, but focused on extracting more value from the instruments that are already available.
All right, thank you for that. Unfortunately, I'm out of time, so I yield back.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to recognize the gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Salinas.
Thank you, and thank you to the chair and our ranking member for working on this good piece of legislation and trying to get to a bipartisan agreement. So although the United States has just a handful of wind turbines off its coast today, we are on the cusp of an offshore wind energy boom that will ramp up clean energy deployment and help meet our growing energy demands. And the industry has been meeting some key milestones following President Biden's establishment of a national goal to install 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, which is enough electricity to power more than 10 million homes for a year. And around a dozen states already have more than that amount in their combined project pipelines. NOAA is set to play a pivotal role in the build-out of America's offshore wind, and the agency's science planning and regulatory responsibilities will be critical for enabling this newer technology of wind energy development that incorporates stakeholder engagement with fishing industries and other ocean users. And as you all know, permitting, stakeholder engagement, and related agency activity really requires immense amounts of staff and resources. So this question is for you, Dr. Jacobs. Do you have any concerns that a significant reorganization of NOAA at this time, at this critical juncture, could result in agency delays, including any permitting delays for offshore wind?
I don't think so. I think that a lot of that process that's done in NOAA, they've got a routine, they know what they're doing. This is something that they do on a regular basis, so I don't see any issue or delays with that.
Okay, and if others would like to,
I think,
Contemplate.
yes, Congresswoman Salinas, I think this act, if modified to move NOAA's protected species responsibilities into the Fish and Wildlife Service, would be very good for the wind energy effort you outlined, because under the Endangered Species Act, anybody who wants to do work and that affects endangered species or threatened species must perform consultations under Section 7 with both the Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA potentially. And having two organizations to have to permit through is much less efficient than having one.
thank you.
Yeah, I would say that we ought to we ought to get a mutual way to deal with that. There's another problem with this. When you put the things in the water, when you put the water deep down enough, you screw up the bottom of the ocean, and that eliminates a lot of the fish that we have there. So there's a need to understand that and get together and at the front edge and deal with it. I mean, that to me is a leadership and management issue that I think we can do if people take a look at it closely. But it's very important, and I'm with you. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so Dr. Lautenbach, I'd be interested to hear your perspective on the idea of moving NOAA's Endangered Species Act responsibilities to the Department of Interior in light of NOAA's expertise related to marine wildlife and fisheries. Can you outline the potential benefits and potentially drawbacks of this idea, and how might Interior's differing mission and capabilities affect the ESA reviews?
My natural, I think these things belong to NOAA, so I do that. NOAA is, I look at the world is 70% water, and in that water lives fish, and one agency working on that, having supreme lead on it, is an important thing, because everybody diddling around and doing this and that doesn't make any sense to me. So we need to look at a way to do that in a way which won't, harm the egos of the other people who are currently involved with it. I can't sit here and tell you I have the perfect answer to that, but I think that we ought to have that mentality. Is the idea is that the entire atmosphere is over. The atmosphere is 100% NOAA. From here, past the sun, the state weather and all of that. And you look at the ocean, you've got an awful lot of that ocean, 70%. And we got this little hunk that we stand on, this two-legged mammals with big brains, we stand on this dirt, okay? But around us is a huge amount of territory, really, which there's a lot of difficulties. And in my view, that's leadership and management. And you've got to manage these things in a way that you can build this, collective, and not everybody get their ego out on the table and say, well, no, that's mine. So I think there's, that requires, I don't know, as much help as we can give it. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm just about out of time. I yield back.
Thank you. And now I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Franklin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here this morning. Appreciate you taking time for your testimony. I think, in all I've read on this topic, seems like an overdue idea. It's something that its time has come. Probably came a long time in the past, but hopefully we can get it over the goal line now. A little by, excuse me, by way of background, I'm from Lakeland, Florida, home of the hurricane hunters. I was on our city commission when we were able to bring those to Lakeland and build out the infrastructure. So appreciate everything that they do. Like a couple of you, I'm also a fellow Naval Academy graduate, oceanography major. So between that, my time as a naval aviator, and then also a general aviation pilot, and then later as an insurance broker for a number of years in Florida, I'm very sensitive to the products that NOAA provides. And there's nothing that gets the attention of Floridians more than the reports that come out every 4 hours during hurricane season. Very critical. You got 23 million people watching those closely. One of the things that we've been frustrated about over time, everybody wants absolute when it comes to storm predictions, and we know we're getting better than we used to be, but too often when we look at the spaghetti models, we see, they all diverge, and Oftentimes, it was the European model that seems to have been more accurate, and I don't know if you guys would agree with that. I would like your opinion, though, on how the U.S. is comparing to Europe, what we need to do to catch up if we're behind. And then, would NOAA being a standalone agency allow you to do the investments and the prioritizations that could help get us better, more timely forecasts in whichever order?
Thank you for the question. Unfortunately, the European Center is still the most accurate modeling system in the world, but the National Weather Service, UFS, is closing the gap. But there's still some things that need to be done, primarily on the optimization of data and the data assimilation system. The model that the Weather Service runs uses a data assimilation that is substandard compared to what the European Center runs. The reason why is the European Center just has a lot more compute to do a lot of their research and development. So it's a compute issue and it's a software engineering challenge. But we have the best in the...
Excuse me, are they also, you mentioned AI before, do you feel that they are farther along in utilizing AI?
No, I actually think private industry is the farthest along with AI that I've seen. And I think that the U.S. is uniquely situated through public-private partnerships to tap into what private industry is doing. And I do think that that could potentially allow the U.S. to leapfrog the European Center with some of the capabilities I've seen, particularly on how fast they can run the same code.
Dr. Guydet?
I totally concur. I think the innovations in the private sector in terms of weather and ocean data collection, assimilation, and prediction and modeling are equivalent to SpaceX for space and NASA. That's happening right now. And NOAA's beginning to understand that and get into these public-private partnerships that I mentioned, and I think doing that quicker would be better, and they can do it better if they were not having to request permission through the Department of Commerce.
Okay. Dr. Lautenbacher?
Yes, I concur with everything that's been said, and I would say that I would think that some of the work that's going on in the commercial satellite industry will help us too. Will provide better information, more timely information to make the models and the AI work even better. So there's and that having an independent, or at least a NOAA that is assigned to do those things, and then given the funds to do it, will make a big difference.
Okay.
Thank you.
Dr. Jacobs, you referred to the branding, and a couple of you have, about being Department of Commerce. I was surprised the first time I saw the aircraft that had Department of Commerce on the side, so I was happy to see that change. Do you think having a standalone force would assist in recruiting and retention of staff, and has that been an issue before with all the uncertainty around, or the confusion around just exactly who NOAA is and who they belong to?
I think, yeah, it's not helpful. It would definitely help with recruiting. I mean, a lot of times when these hurricane hunters do their hurricane awareness tours, that's where they're looking for. That's when the public gets to go up and touch and see the planes and walk around, and that's kind of between that and maybe the National Hurricane Center, what gets the most press, and that's what gets the future generations excited. These are the facilities, particularly in Lakeland, where kids will go on field trips and visit and see these facilities. I think that's really important.
And I'd like to chime in there, Congressman, and just say that NASA's space mission is important, but NOAA, as everyone has acknowledged, is affecting every American life every day. So putting NOAA on par with NASA would recognize all that it does and give it more positive exposure, and therefore attract the talent and perform the recruiting function you identify.
Roger that.
As the gentleman that was there when we had to move the airplanes, I want to thank you first of all for doing that, because that was a big step in our lives. I also have family who live in Florida, so I'm very interested in what goes on there, and I appreciate your interest in it, and I certainly support the things that have just been said.
Thank you, gentlemen, and I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Fushi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, witnesses, for appearing this morning and for your testimony at today's hearing. I appreciate this opportunity to discuss this legislation draft, as well as some key considerations affecting my district, which is North Carolina's 4th. I would like to highlight 2 NOAA programs in particular: the National Sea Grant College Program and the Regional Climate Centers Program. Led in partnership with NOAA, The North Carolina Sea Grant Program is among 34 Sea Grant initiatives nationwide and operates as an interinstitutional program of the University of North Carolina system. For decades, NC Sea Grant has been at the forefront of valuable research, education, and outreach efforts across the state, helping to build more resilient communities by assisting with planning, recovery, responding and adapting to coastal and inland hazards, supporting sustainable fisheries and aquaculture, and promoting healthy coastal ecosystems, all while facilitating workforce development through its engagement in undergraduate and graduate student fellowships and research. The NCC grant generates $4 million in annual economic benefit for the state, and the National Sea Grant Program leverages nearly $3 for every dollar appropriated by Congress. I would also like to mention the Southeast Regional Climate Center, based in my district at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. It is one of 6 regional climate centers that are administered across the country in partnership with NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information. These centers make up a national network managing and operating sophisticated climate information systems and provide authoritative expertise on regional and national climate matters to federal, state, and local government agencies, businesses, farmers, students, and the general public. These centers also monitor regional climate anomalies and extreme weather events to assist with planning, mitigation, and recovery efforts. So my questions are related to the Sea Grant and Regional Climate Centers program because they're both critical to my home state and throughout our nation. So I'm wondering if you can speak to concerns that some may have about how existing programs within NOAA could be impacted by becoming an independent agency. So Dr. Jacobs, we'll start with you.
Those are fantastic programs. I can't say enough great stuff about them, particularly with the grants, the extramural money, the cooperative institutes. I think an independent NOAA would actually be beneficial to them, to be honest. I think it would be very, very helpful. It would be more efficient. We move some of the layers of bureaucracy would actually able NOAA to probably push more money out.
And I have to agree with Dr. Jacobs. I think not having to staff requests for either partnership activities that you outline, it just would allow NOAA to be more efficient and effective in executing those partnerships. And I agree, Sea Grant and the NCEI are 2 great programs under NOAA.
I concur with that, and I would mention that I've served on the board of SICORA, which after leaving my job with the government, with the federal government, and I've served on that board, and I'm aware of those programs, and I support them entirely. And I think that having an elevated NOAA presence in terms of people understanding what it does, and it's laid out that they do this kind of operations and support, that would be a great boon to you as well as all the other states that have water crashing on them all the time. So thank you.
Thank you. And secondly, recruiting and retaining a diverse and skilled workforce is paramount to NOAA meeting its mission. And in this committee, before we have discussed the missing millions of women, Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous people who have been traditionally underrepresented in the STEM workforce. With NOAA projected to have a large proportion of its workforce retire within the next few years, Dr. Lautenbacher and then Dr. Gallaudet, please, can you elaborate on how an independent NOAA could restructure its hiring process to be more efficient and address workforce recruitment and retention issues?
I think that's very important, and we certainly when I was there, we have tried hard to do that, and I think that we're continuing with it. But it's not easy to take groups of people that have never thought about being scientists in the ocean and the water and all that sort of thing. I mean, so you've got to find people that have knowledge that they need, and we need to publicize that, and we need to provide opportunities for people that are in college, and that an independent NOAA would have a better way of doing that and getting to the place where we could find the talent. The talent's always needed, and certainly in the areas of our coastal regions, it's critical. So I'm a big fan of doing that. Thank you.
And I'll just quickly refer to my opening statement, Congresswoman, about management. Having two different management layers to do the hiring doesn't make sense to me, and it doesn't make good business sense, and we could address those important issues by making NOAA independent.
Thank you. That's my time, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I heard it, sir, it said earlier that NOAA affects Americans every day. And I think I just want to give you an example of what, as a consumer, I guess, in a way, sees an example of marketing and branding from NOAA. NOAA is considering a 10-knot speed limit that the agency claims would protect the North Atlantic right whale. And as I understand it, these whales have only been struck by boats 5 times in the past 15 years. As one of countless Americans who enjoy sport fishing and ocean recreation and preserving the resources that make them possible, it's frustrating that the agency would consider a rule like this despite the impact it would have on an entire industry and Americans' access to the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico. Dr. Lautenbacher, is this bill going to make NOAA more accountable to the American people or less?
I hope it makes them more accountable. I mean, certainly, we want to be sure that we are not, at least, and again, I'm not the current head of NOAA, so I can't talk to you directly about it. When I talk where I was and where I believe that we need to deal with the entire set of issues that go with commercial fishing versus the protection of certain species. And half of my day was spent usually trying to work on those kinds of problems. But I think it's important to have it inside of NOAA so that we can do that in a more, quickly and efficiently with the right people at the right time. And that's critically important. I think it's an important issue for NOAA.
Would anybody else like to comment? Because I had something else I want to add to that, too.
Yes, sir. I'd say that it will make NOAA more accountable and be more responsive to public interests like yours. I'm a recreational boater and former Navy deck watch officer, and removing the department from their accountability chain would allow them to be more responsive to the public's needs.
Mr. Jacob, Dr. Jacob?
I completely agree.
Hey, was that a directive from another agency? Was that part of another mission that was brought into NOAA that y'all have been talking about earlier? Does that make sense?
Sir, Congressman, I think you're referring to the speed limit?
That's right, the 10-knot speed limit.
I can't answer for my former agency.
Yeah.
But so I'm not sure. Don't know. I think you'll have to go to the department.
All right. Switching gears, and I know y'all have talked about this already, but it's my understanding that NOAA, like other federal agencies, y'all have said with public-private entities, as this legislation's written, is it going to rein in this agency so that things that you're doing in-house that are commercially available to be done in private, are you going to be able to push more towards the private sector?
I think so, definitely. There's a lot of opportunity in the private sector, and it's a matter of NOAA doing a lot of outreach, seeing what's available, testing it, and at least in the last probably 5, 6, 7 years, there's been a tremendous shift to bring the private sector more into public-private partnerships within the agency, and I only see that growing going forward.
Why would it change? I mean, why couldn't you do it now?
Well, you certainly can do it now, but I think, for example, a lot of these instruments are built by private industry, even the ones that NOAA buys. It's not a very large leap to think that you could, in the future, be buying data as a subscription service versus actually buying the instrument and managing it yourself. To me, it's a better business model. It actually puts the liability on industry instead of the taxpayer.
Congressman, there's an example of that called the Commercial Weather Data Program, which was initiated with the Weather Research and Forecasting Innovation Act, and that's growing within NOAA. And I concur with Dr. Jacobs that the opportunities are expanding. I think making NOAA independent will allow them to move faster. I signed and supported over a dozen agreements with the private sector and philanthropies while I was at NOAA, and each time we had to go through the general counsel at the Department of Commerce, and that takes time, some of them excessively long, and so just doing an independent NOAA would allow them to be more agile and accelerate those types of efforts.
I got you. I understand that now. Appreciate it.
I would like to just mention that NOAA does have other transaction authority, OTA, and the reason why it's probably not being utilized more is because of a high level of risk aversion at the Department of Commerce level.
Thank you. My time's up. Appreciate it, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I'd like to recognize the gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Sykes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Chair and Ranking Member of the committee for bringing forth these fantastic witnesses to talk to us about this issue. You know, one of the things that I have prioritized in my committee assignments is connecting the work that we do here in committee back to my district and back at home. And science, space, and technology isn't always as intuitive as a connection. But I want to bring back to our #1 industry in Ohio, which is agriculture. And in particularly in Northeast Ohio, it has the most concentrated amount of farmland in our northeastern quadrant of the state. And so farming is a way of life in Northeast Ohio, if you will. And the ability to predict weather patterns is pretty significant. So for example, in 2019, weather prevented about 63,000 acres from being planted. About 15% of Ohio's farmland across the state went unplanted because of extreme weather events that did not allow for it. And I recall at my time as a legislator in these conversations, not being able to understand weather patterns appropriately to address the needs and adjust quickly, and then the impact on crop insurance and whether or not farmers were able to get payouts were all very detrimental and harmful to the economy of our state. And so one of the things that I have come to understand is NOAA is under the Department of Commerce. Not something that I would have known, but for being in this position, I'm sure, and most others would not either. But looking at a graph that you all produced around that 2019 event, those extreme weather events, you all were able to produce the economic impact, which was upwards to $5 billion of loss that we saw in Ohio. And it seems intuitive that because you were in the Department of Commerce, you were able to do that type of analysis. So if we're going to move NOAA out of the Department of Commerce into your own agency, if you could, and anyone can answer this question, talk about how you will still be able to be nimble, to talk about the economies, scale up those types of predictions while also doing the weather predicting that our farmers rely upon, not only just to feed us, but for our economy.
I couldn't agree more. That capability is invaluable, particularly at the seasonal to subseasonal range, which is highly sought after by the agriculture community. I think those numbers, those financial estimates, are probably on the low side. I think that there's been some studies that I've seen, at least indirect fluctuations with U.S. GDPs about 4%. And globally, it's probably at least $1.5, if not $2 trillion. But I would like to mention that a lot of these studies are done inside of NOAA. So NOAA has their own chief economist who does a lot of this analysis.
So if I could, so the information I got was from NOAA. So you're saying that your own study was probably underreported of what the actual impact might have been in the state of Ohio?
Well, a lot of these studies are based on money of insurance claims. But that's not, there's a much broader financial indirect economic impact. And so whatever the number is, it's a lot larger than that number, which means that the mission services that NOAA provides are financially far more critical than I think they get credit for.
And to get at your question, ma'am, NOAA has the people that do this, as Dr. Jacobs said, and they don't need Commerce to review, approve, or even weigh in. They have the expertise in-house, and making NOAA independent would not harm or delay that function.
Yeah, I can't add to that. That's exactly right. And we should continue it. And I think it's the way to connect the things that are important to us.
Thank you for all three of you for that answer and the response. Because again, as I go back home and I talk about the work that I'm doing and being able to articulate my reason of being on this committee is, in fact, we're being underserved by your lack of independence is something that I can sell to my community, not just sell, but to communicate and why we are going to move forward in the way we are. If I could move over to a topic that my colleague from North Carolina talked about with increasing the diversity within your departments and the ability to be more nimble, to encourage more folks. I think part of your rebranding might be helpful. People don't know what they don't know. And being able to create an agency and promote it so folks do feel like they have the opportunity, that they could be a part of climate and in this capacity that's maybe not in the EPA, maybe not in the Department of Agriculture, maybe not in NASA, but very specifically in meteorology or elsewhere. And so I do hope that you all think through and continue to encourage the missing million to be a part of your agency if you are to spin off and become independent.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. And I have a few questions. First off, I want to say thank you for the witnesses for being here. All three of you have a vast array of expertise, which I'm very impressed with. I have the privilege of serving as the chairman of our subcommittee on space and aeronautics, where NASA's collaboration with both other agencies like NOAA and commercial partners has played a key role in our nation's space program. NASA has historically partnered with industry to design and build first-of-a-kind spacecraft and instruments that are then picked up by operational agencies like NOAA, USGS, and DOD, as well as the commercial sector. Dr. Jacobs, the first question is, NOAA has slowly adopted a commercial approach to GPS radio occultation data buys. Are there any lessons learned from this process? Is there anything Congress should do regarding WMO 40 in future legislation to better enable innovation and leverage industry innovation?
So WMO's Resolution 40 presents a pricing challenge because the way it's structured, it considers GPS radio occultation to be an essential data set, which requires mandatory free and open redistribution. And if you're a private company, and you sell your data to NOAA and they give it away to the rest of the planet for free, you're essentially the only customer of that company. And when I was at NOAA, I sort of looked at this as my mission was to have the best forecast because my budget was the same. And so agreeing to more restrictive redistribution rights actually allowed me to buy more data because I was able to, pay for not having to essentially buy out other potential customers. And so I think really thinking about redistribution rights, the price point, but then also considering that there is a potential for when you share data internationally, there are other commercial companies that exist in other countries that data might get shared back. So this is almost a WMO data sharing challenge.
And Congressman, if I may, just add one
Yes,
thing, that under the commercial weather data program at NOAA, they've limited it to a few data types. Initially, it started as EO, radio occultation, RO, and I think expanding that to other data types that exist now in the private sector, like ocean data and other satellite-type data, would be very good for NOAA's capabilities in terms of predicting and producing life-saving warning.
Great, thank you very much. Many of the observations NOAA uses for weather prediction depend on the use of electromagnetic spectrum that is bound by physics. If NOAA was to become an independent agency, how could it better communicate the weather impacts of spectrum decisions in interagency and international meetings? Dr. Jacobs, and then followed by anyone else who would like to answer that.
Well, I had a lot of experience with this firsthand with the Department of Commerce, and one of the biggest challenges I had was actually with the other bureaus. This is NTIA's job, really. And so it was really incumbent on the folks in NOAA and NASA, and particularly NESDIS, to actually do their own potential out-of-bands emissions interference studies. And I think NOAA, as an independent agency, would be able to not have to balance a lot of other priorities that the Department of Commerce might see, because NTIA is getting requests from other spectrum users from across the government.
Okay. Last question. For the two admirals. As you two admirals on the panel know, the DoD has a robust resource allocation process that aligns agency requirements with budgets. Over the years, NOAA has attempted to stand up similar capabilities, such as the strategy, execution, and evaluation process, and the program planning and execution system in the past. How could NOAA, as an independent agency, better align resources with the requirements and limit the funding of, quote, desirements, unquote?
Yeah, the idea of having a specific program for us, what should NOAA be doing? We can better define that, and it can be set up legally or in the law so that it's going to be done that way. And then it can be inspected and looked at and decided, well, we don't like that, we'll change it, or whatever. But the point is that you can't just expect the agency, which one day is told to do this, and the next day is told to do something else, and then somebody takes the money out, and then expect a program that's going to be doing what you want it to do. And I think that if we create that in the proper way in our propositions for the laws that we put in place, that we can do that, and I think we should.
Thank you. And how about you, Dr. Gallaudet?
Congressman, I think that, yes, making NOAA independent would allow it to be more efficient in its budgeting process and not have to have with competing interests of a department that may not be aligned in terms of their desirements for the budget. Removing that conflict would allow NOAA to be more effective and efficient in its budgeting.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you. My time's expired, and I'd like to recognize the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member, and our panelists for your testimony today. NOAA's done important work in my district, particularly in the areas of weather forecasting and flood risk management. NOAA also provides river observations and flood warnings for the three major rivers that flow through my district, the Allegheny, the Monongahela, and Ohio. And it helps local officials and residents prepare for and respond to floods. NOAA also helps to ensure that the water is safe for consumption and that any environmental threats are identified and addressed in a timely fashion. Pittsburgh is part of Pennsylvania's coastal zone, which extends along the shores of Lake Erie. NOAA's Office for Coastal Management provides tools to help manage the coastal zone, including shoreline erosion and water quality issues. I'm sure every member present here today can speak to great benefits NOAA has provided to our constituents in our districts. We need to continue to highlight the crucial science NOAA supports and how this work changes the lives for the better. But as we review this bill, we need to ensure that independent NOAA will support the needs and concerns of the American people in the most efficient way. So my questions are for Dr. Lautenbacher. If NOAA were to become an independent agency as prescribed by this draft bill, how can we ensure that inherent governmental functions of NOAA can't be outsourced or contracted to private organizations?
I think it's important to decide how you want to do that, and I think that should be part of what we do when we have this new bill or whatever it's going to be for determining the comments that you've talked about. It is important. Everything you said has to be done. It has to be done right, and it has to continue to be done right, and it should be managed properly. And NOAA should be, stated It's stated for NOAA to do that and to make it as feasible as possible. And the other thing that's important is that NOAA's never had any money to really advertise what they do so they can get hold of people and explain what it is. If you have that kind of connection, there are many other agencies that have that ability. NOAA needs that ability as well so that you can figure out, are you getting what, you have someone you can go to and say, where can you help me with this? Or whatever piece is not missing. So the connection with the public is very important. And that ought to be in the Organic Act in some way. That's my feeling.
Sorry. Thank you, Maxwell. Similarly, to that end, in your opinion as a former NOAA administrator, how can Congress help to support NOAA administratively to support the scientific research and development that countless Americans benefit from on a daily basis beyond what's entailed in this legislation?
Appropriating NOAA's mission to the fullest extent will help achieve that end, ma'am.
Thank you. Similarly, as a NOAA administrator, what oversight lapses occurred as a result of NOAA having both cross-agency and disjointed jurisdiction over issue areas that would be changed with this bill?
Congresswoman, I think I laid out in my testimony quite well that we were impeded in different areas by the Department of Commerce. And so, for example, that seafood executive order that took 2 years to get through the White House when it could have been in less than one, that is just one of numerous examples.
Thank you. I'll yield back my time.
I'd like to recognize the, who's next? Gentleman from California, Mr. Obernolte.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Jacobs, you said something in your testimony that really struck me. You said that the additional layers of bureaucracy that exist because of the way that NOAA is seated under Commerce do not add value to NOAA's scientific mission. And I think that the truth of that's probably self-evident. I would also observe that the additional layers of bureaucracy around Congress do not add value to Congress's mission. But I know Congressman Posey asked you about this as well. A cynic would say that spinning off NOAA as its own department would actually add bureaucracy rather than subtract it. Can you explain why that's not the case?
Well, there are things that Department of Commerce does for NOAA, for example, like payroll, retirement, stuff like that, that if NOAA was an independent agency, they'd have to do that themselves. But it's more of this level of just clearance. Everything we did from a potential all-hands email to a spin plan to budget approval had to go through several different layers in the Department of Commerce. And it's usually being reviewed by people that don't really understand NOAA's mission and they don't really have the scientific expertise. That's not their job. And so to me, it just felt very unnecessary, and we'd have to spend a lot of time rewriting and explaining stuff that was just, honestly kind of just a waste of resources.
Right, I understand. Dr. Galladay, in your testimony, you related some really poignant examples of ways in which NOAA's budget had been raided by Commerce to address other pressing budgetary needs that Commerce had that detracted from NOAA's scientific mission. And I think that's something that everyone on this dais is interested in helping you avoid in the future. However, we are also really intensely focused on governmental efficiency right now. As you know, we have one of the largest budget deficits in the history of our country that we're grappling with. So we're also not interested in increasing federal spending. Would NOAA, as its own agency, be able to exist with the existing budget that it has under Commerce?
Congressman, thank you for your question. I cannot speak for the agency, but I believe it would not need more resources if it were to become independent, if that's your question.
That was my question, yeah, whether or not this would increase federal spending. And while I've got you, I'd like to ask you something else about your testimony, because you also related some, what I found to be really fascinating examples of the way that private innovation was helping NOAA fulfill its mission, and some of the public-private partnerships that you had entered into. And your comment was that an independent NOAA would be more effective at catalyzing those relationships. Could you take a minute and explain why that is?
Yes, sir. Dr. Jacobs mentioned this, and I did as well, that we've entered into, when we were with NOAA, well over a dozen, probably several of these partnerships with the private sector and philanthropies. And in each of those, to get approval to move forward required staffing this through the Department of Commerce, as Dr. Jacob mentioned, who often did not know or understand the purpose. And I think a good way to sort of address that is, if you look at he and I, PhD in atmospheric science, PhD in oceanography, also certification as a meteorologist and forecaster, leading the agency that does that, and having to get the Commerce Department with mostly who are educated in law and political science to approve the work we were doing really didn't make sense and added no value.
Right. Okay. So you're arguing that there's a bureaucratic delay involved. Are there examples where Commerce refused to approve programs that you thought were worthwhile?
Congressman, I'll have to get back to you on that. I have to give it some thought.
All right. Do you think that it has deterred potential partners in the private sector to have these layers of bureaucracy above you?
Yeah, I think so. I heard quite often from private sector companies that had a capability that NOAA actually needed and wanted, and just the hurdles of getting through the process, whether it was the commercial remote sensing license agreements or things like that, some of them just threw up their hands and said, it's not worth it. We can't deal with this.
Right. Well, I'm not surprised to hear that. Well, we're certainly looking forward to helping you solve that problem in the future, and I want to thank you for your testimony today. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and I'd like to recognize a gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you very much, Chair Babin. Also, I don't see Mr. Lucas, but thank you to Chair Lucas and Ranking Member Lofgren. Thank you to the witnesses. I'm glad you're here today. This is a critical conversation, and it really has to do with the future of NOAA, an agency that's so critical to providing vital services for our nation. This NOAA Organic Act establishes, as we've discussed, a separate authorization for NOAA, excuse me, making it independent from the Department of Commerce. I know it's aiming to enhance the agency's responsibilities by promoting scientific integrity and strategic research. Those are laudable goals, but I'm hoping for more clarity and clear intent in a few areas. NOAA has helped lead the nation's efforts in observing, measuring, assessing, protecting, and managing coastal, ocean, and Great Lakes areas and their natural resources. Their work is timely in the face of climate change and resulting challenges to coastal communities. And although I respect the chairman and do not question his motivation, I'm concerned that the legislation we're discussing omits NOAA's ocean conservation, protection, and sustainable fisheries management work, making the future of these efforts uncertain or at least unclear. I'm specifically concerned about the possibility of moving NOAA's Office of Protected Resources, or OPR, Endangered Species and Marine Mammal Protection, to the Department of Interior. Find the intent of this legislative language unclear. For example, would this push the OPR out in favor of industry-led management? Would it clarify that commercial fishing and other interests would not overlap with ocean protections of an agency? Under the legislation, the National Academy of Sciences is tasked with conducting the feasibility study. I'm not convinced this is the correct entity to determine how to move this work across agencies. And additionally, if the intent is to prevent cuts to unauthorized NOAA programs, the committee should consider a clean authorization of the structure and mission of NOAA as an agency under Commerce. We must consider the risk of removing NOAA from a cabinet-level department, a move that could diminish its ability to direct and influence critical policy decisions, and most concerningly, its ability to maintain reliable funding. I know you've addressed these issues in your testimony, but many of us have been debating, as you know, similar proposals for several years. That goes back far before I joined this committee more than 11 years ago. It's essential that we keep in mind and discuss all of the ramifications of this legislation. For example, with research integrity, foreign contracts, lack of authorization of NOAA programs under the purview of other House committees, and others. So that's all to say that today's conversation should be the first of many. I know and trust the chairman to go forward with due diligence, and as we consider authorizing NOAA, we must take the time to consider all areas, not just focus on a few while leaving other questions unanswered. NOAA is more than a weather and satellite agency. They say it best themselves. Our reach goes from the surface of the sun to the depths of the ocean floor. We must do our part to maintain their critical work. So I want to excuse me, ask a question particularly to Dr. Jacobs and Dr. Gallaudet, because I appreciated your work on this. I've done a lot of work over the years regarding sexual harassment at NOAA, particularly on research vessels. Dr. Sullivan was a leader on the issue, and I know both of you, Dr. Gallaudet and Dr. Jacobs, pledged to carry out that work, and I appreciate that. Sexual harassment and assault creates a hostile environment for women in science, affects their ability to achieve their full potential. And as we have discussed in this committee, these problems are exacerbated in complex remote environments, as detailed in a recent NSF commissioned report on the U.S. Antarctic program. Many NOAA research sites share characteristics with the environment described in that report, remote locations with on-site living quarters and military presence. So how did NOAA interact with the Department of Commerce in investigating and adjudicating allegations of sexual harassment, and what must an independent NOAA consider when standing up its capability to intake and investigate claims of sexual harassment and assault? Dr. Gallaudet and Dr. Jacobs, please.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Yes, I think that we together established NOAA's first office to address sexual assault and harassment and prevention. And we move forward in advancing that program with your great help. Thank you very much. And so I think an independent NOAA will only allow the agency to continue those efforts and to focus and be more efficient in them.
Thank you. Dr. Jacobs?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, we didn't have an opportunity to have a lot of new starts, but the Workplace Violence Prevention Program was one of them, and thank you for the support on that. I think it's great at NOAA. I think it's showing a lot of promise, and when you're able to have that internal to the agency and bring in your own investigators and do everything in-house, it's a lot more effective and a lot more efficient.
Well, was there interaction with the Department of Commerce during that process, or was it really inside NOAA?
Once we stood up the Workplace Violence Prevention Program inside of NOAA, they pretty much stayed away from it. That was one of the things that they actually didn't bother us with.
There was information sharing, but which takes time,
Right.
of course, data calls, et cetera, but it didn't necessarily, it didn't interfere with the work of the office, but it created extra work.
Understood. Thank you. And I'm out of time. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Strong.
Thank you, Chairman Lucas. I'd also like to thank our witnesses for sharing their expertise with us today. As my colleagues have mentioned today, NOAA's use of space-based technology such as Earth observation satellites protect our communities from natural disasters and serve and severe weather. NOAA's services provide critical data and analysis to keep our nation safe and enables a thriving space-based economy. As mentioned, NOAA's plan to leverage commercial technologies to support research and development. My colleagues have talked a little bit about this already. Specifically, what would this change allow NOAA to better collaborate with NASA's office, such as Marshall Space Flight Center?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, I think NOAA's done good work, which we continued in terms of partnering with the commercial space sector. And in fact, there was an architecture study that we pushed forward and supported to diversify NOAA's satellite architecture to include a range of purpose-built or shared, potentially, sensors and platforms with the private sector. And that's advancing and moving forward. So I think a good statement of NOAA's performance is important in terms of satellite program management. In 2020, we announced that we saved the Polar Follow-On program over $735 million from earlier cost estimates. And in addition, we gave the DoD weather satellite. We had a spare, the GOES 13. They had a critical gap in Indo-PACOM, and because of our superior performance in environmental satellite program management, we were able to afford them a capability that would have taken them millions of dollars in tens of years.
Thank you. If NOAA supports the participation of scientific community in research and development for including the private sector and academia, what kind of subject matter experts would be appointed to the Science Advisory Board?
Well, the Science Advisory Board, when members roll off, it's usually up to the administrator to appoint whatever subject matter experts are key to their particular priorities. Right now, there's a very good mix on there, and I think that from what I've seen with the recent power report that came out, a lot of really good suggestions, particularly on ways to advance numerical weather prediction and better utilize computational resources.
Thank you. How will NOAA collect input provided by external stakeholders in the national, regional, and state level?
Thank you, Congressman. Already, NOAA has processes in place to do this at every level, nationally with this fine body as well as at the local level. And I don't see a need necessarily to replace them, only reinforce and adding them. And as I mentioned previously, we could reinforce those relationships by being independent and having the agency have more freedom and less burdens in terms of data reporting and permissions requesting.
Thank you. I thank each of you for coming before us. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And now I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Sorensen.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank the Science, Space, and Technology Committee for holding this important hearing. The question of NOAA independence has a long history, as we've heard today. The agency does a tremendous service, not only to the people of my district in Illinois 17, but the American public. As the first meteorologist in Congress in nearly 50 years, I'd like to take my questions down a meteorological path. First, for the whole panel, we have millions of data observations that are used to produce a weather forecast. We know that more good data that goes into an equation yields a more accurate conclusion. What observing systems should we invest in for the future, and how?
I'll take that. Thank you for the question. I think it's got to be a mix of space-based remotely sense observing systems and in situ observing systems. I think that you can never have enough observations because numerical weather prediction is an initial value problem. But the interesting aspect of this is through the algorithms in the data assimilation system, you can calculate what's known as a forecast sensitivity to observation impact. And it tells you exactly how much impact each observation has in the model, whether it's positive or negative. That's a very convenient metric if you want to do a cost-benefit analysis to then go look at which observing systems should you invest more in or which aren't providing as much impact as you thought they would.
And again, for the whole panel, as probabilistic weather forecasts improve, what are the final steps that are needed to translate these forecasts into actionable information so the public will learn to and find ways to protect their life and property?
The missing thing here, in my opinion, is what I would call the last mile. The National Weather Service needs a mobile, flexible, agile workforce that's really embedded in the emergency management community. And having the mobile support is going to require an investment in moving AWIPs to the cloud. But the trick is, once you have cloud-based AWIPs, the forecasters can have laptops they can embed amongst the emergency management community, and you almost eliminate that concern about how do you translate this forecast information to the end user.
And finally, there's been a big push over recent years in within NOAA, to incorporate social science research into some of the National Weather Service products. How is the research being transitioned into operations, and how should advancements be verified? And specifically, I was at the Quad Cities National Weather Service office just this past week. As we look at the probability of major flood on the Mississippi River, how can we get people to react to the forecasts as we see them?
Thank you again for the question. The National Weather Service it's a physical science agency, but it really has a behavioral mission. And it's a social science challenge. I think that a lot of it's been in the research and development in OAR, and it needs to be shifted into the operations at the National Weather Service. But the real problem there is verification. There's no verification data. What's needed are routine data collections of how the public received and understood and reacted to the warning information. That information doesn't exist right now, and particularly, and unfortunately, with the circumstances of fatalities, the National Weather Service needs to know, how did these fatalities occur? What were the circumstances? Was the person trying to evacuate? Did they understand the warning and act accordingly, and it was just bad luck? Or did they not understand the warning, or did they not have the means to evacuate? We're not able to differentiate those metrics. And without that type of verification, the social scientists are going to have a really hard time deciding whether or not what they're implementing is effective.
Finally, do you all, and I'll pose this to all of you, do you believe that we are investing enough in our weather modeling so that we can best serve the people and keep them safe?
No, it needs a lot more.
And to the rest of you too.
I concur. NOAA could use more funding and for its program, like I mentioned, the Earth Prediction Innovation Center and the Unified Forecast System.
I agree completely.
Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate that, and I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize the gentlewoman from Virginia, Ms. McClellan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Lofgren, for planning this hearing on NOAA today. I would say as a 18-year state legislator who served on the Agriculture, Natural Resources, and Conservation Committee, I relied heavily on NOAA both to inform my constituents on different weather events hitting Virginia, but also in our work on that committee, particularly around marine life. And I'll have to say I'm very disappointed at NOAA's decision to move the Marine Operations Center from Norfolk to Rhode Island, but I will save those questions for another hearing. But I do want to focus on the fact that the 4th District of Virginia is part of the Chesapeake Bay watershed, where there are ongoing environmental restoration efforts. And the NOAA's Chesapeake Bay office, formally established by Congress in 1992, partners with federal agencies, state and local governments, nonprofits, academic institutions, and others to improve the health of the Chesapeake Bay, which is critically important not only to Virginia, but the entire Bay watershed area. Could you speak to how such efforts and partnerships may be impacted if NOAA were to become an independent scientific agency?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Having property on the Chesapeake Bay, Western Shore in Maryland, your question is near and dear to my heart. I think NOAA would be able to improve its partnerships and conservation mission for the Chesapeake Bay and everywhere in the U.S. exclusive economic zone, because being independent would allow them to manage their programs more independently, autonomously, and efficiently.
Thank you. We've recently seen the consequences of the rejection of scientific evidence in favor of partisanship, and it's imperative that the science produced at NOAA be free from political interference. How would an independent NOAA safeguard that process?
One of the things that I did while I was there was revisit the scientific integrity policy with the help of the staff office and line offices. And I think it's the gold standard in government agencies. But the challenge is, as good as it is, it's only enforceable downward. It's not enforceable upward. There's absolutely nothing NOAA can do, even no matter how great their scientific integrity policy is, to enforce it upwards to Department of Commerce. And I think an independent agency would have full control over that policy, and they wouldn't have to worry about levels above them that can change that.
Thank you for that. And the NOAA Organic Act includes climate as part of NOAA's mission, but doesn't specify NOAA's role in providing climate services. Could you speak to the impact of codifying the significant work NOAA is currently doing in climate services?
As far as, I mean, NOAA is the lead agency when it comes to the mission of climate. I mean, everything they do, from observing the Earth to doing the forecast, to running the models, the research and development, particularly some of the model work coming out of GFDL, it's phenomenal. I mean, they are the gold standard when it comes to climate analysis and projections. And I think that this is obviously going to be something that is going to be more challenges coming forward in the future, and something that they're going to have to more heavily invest in. Looking forward to that.
Thank you. And finally, one of the National Weather Service's forecast offices is in my district in Wakefield. And could you discuss any impact that the that any changes to the NOAA Organic Act could have on the National Weather Service's operations, particularly during weather emergencies.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I think because of the operational nature of the National Weather Service and the language in the draft bill, that none of their mission or functions would be affected.
Great. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Now I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Baird.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I always appreciate the expert witnesses that we have for these committee meetings and the value that you add for sharing with us what you think is important. But so I appreciate all of you being here, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. But as we already know, the National Centers for Environmental Information, NCEIs, manage 6 different regional climate centers across the U.S. My district is fortunate enough, which is West Central Indiana, to be home to one of these centers. And the Midwest Regional Climate Center, also known as MRCC, serves the 9 Midwestern states and provides critical climate data and climate summaries of the region. In fact, right now we're planting corn in that area. But this data and research help develop climate information for practices for agriculture and many other areas when looking at future weather prediction and preparation. So my question is, how will the NOAA Organic effect have on regional climate centers across the MRCC? And how will that impact their function? And will it impact their research? And would there be other benefits? And this question is for all the witnesses.
I would hope there isn't much of a change, and if there's any change, it's going to be improved. There needs to be more interest in defining NOAA's, in my view, requirements of things they ought to do. And what you've just discussed is important. And it's not only important to do it, it's important to advertise it, to get it through to the public. So we need more informational, say, ducts to feed the areas that require this kind of information. It's very important. I'm not a current member, so I don't know if there's any plans. I'll leave that to the other 2 gentlemen here. Any to create new centers or to do any basic work to them. But I'm strongly in support of having a way to get the information and to advertise it in a way that people understand the value of it.
Thank you very much. You know, there's so much information that it does require a continual effort to make sure we educate people. So thank you.
I agree with that. It does take continued education, and that ought to be into the process as we go forward.
Well, let's take that into account. I agree.
Thank you.
Next.
Yes, Congressman, really consistent with my previous statements. The draft bill would not interfere with any of NOAA's missions, climate or weather or otherwise, and in fact would only allow the agency and its leadership to be more efficient and effective.
I would agree with the other witnesses. I don't see this changing that at all.
My next question is more of a general nature, but I'd like to have a response from all 3 of you as well. And, you know, as your experiences as administrators, are there any specific areas within NOAA that have been fallen behind due to bureaucratic processes put in place by the Department of Commerce? So I guess my real question is, are there areas that we can do, and we can do as this committee, to help improve the specific areas of NOAA?
Thank you, Congressman. I'll begin and just say that no specific mission set would be rapidly advanced, if you will, by making it independent. It'd really be across the board. And it's by having not to do all, limiting or freeing NOAA from all the administrative reviews and data calls and analyses, which slow the agency's ability to make changes and advances and conduct initiatives. like those that we've done. And for example, we did establish a new NOAA Uncrewed Systems program and office that is operating autonomous vessels and aircraft and underwater vehicles. And that, again, like the seafood competitive order I referred to, competitiveness executive order that I referred to earlier, took much longer than it needed to because of having to staff these through the Department of Commerce. NOAA has the expertise, knowledge to move forward as it should, and I don't think having a layer of bureaucracy that doesn't understand it as well as the agency does isn't helpful.
I see I'm out of time, so I appreciate that, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, yes, sir. Thank you. And now I'd like to recognize the gentlewoman from Colorado, Ms. Carveo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. NOAA has a significant presence in Colorado, so I appreciate Chairman Lucas's leadership on the subject and openness to making this legislation a bipartisan effort. Like many people, I have benefited and rely on work that happens under NOAA, and in Colorado and across the country, we have experienced an increased amount of severe weather events. These events are not only displacing families, but are also exacerbating an already limited health facilities and resources that disadvantaged and rural communities in particular have access to. Disadvantaged communities already face the biggest challenge of evacuating and getting back into safe housing post-disaster, all of which contribute to long-term health disparities. So for the panel, how does a codified NOAA help support a mission of more localized forecasting granularity and midterm seasonal forecasting?
Well, I think when you're looking at the mission requirements, particularly this is what I was saying earlier with the National Weather Service, it's really the final mile. So you're going from the forecast offices to the actual emergency management community, to the stakeholders in the community, and getting that information to them in a more distributed, flexible way. And I think it's going to be very, very beneficial, but there's some technical challenges that need to be overcome before that can happen. But I really think that that's the future, particularly when it comes to rapid response, severe warnings, things like that.
And Congressman, also, as I've mentioned previously, NOAA's able to make some of these advances in partnerships with the private sector, and being independent and not having to staff those partnership requests through another layer of legal review at the department would allow them to occur faster and do more for the agency and for the public that they serve.
Can you all speak as to what messaging needs to happen? I remember when I was little, there was constant focus on tornado warnings, right, in Colorado. And so what messaging do you think is necessary for people to understand the risks that we're facing and to be able to respond?
So that's really a challenge for the social scientist community. They are the ones and right now they're situated on the research side of NOAA. The information that they're studying, how to properly message so that you get a desired response from someone when it comes to a watch or a warning, that's a behavioral challenge. And that the research they're doing is phenomenal, but at this point it needs to be transitioned into operations. The forecasters need to be implementing this. And one of the things I mentioned earlier was we're still lacking verification of this. We know that there are fatalities. We don't know the circumstances of the fatality. Did the person understand what to do with the warning and just ignored it? Or did they try to respond and it was just an unfortunate situation? There are different circumstances. Without that feedback, the social scientist community is still missing the ability to tailor their messages.
Great, thank you. I just kind of finish up. I learned a lot about NOAA while preparing for this hearing, and I don't think that a lot of people know that it's the oldest science agency in the U.S. With that in mind, I just kind of wanted to generally give you an opportunity to speak about some of the programs and research that happens under NOAA, anything that would be good for people to know about or that you want to highlight that hasn't been touched upon.
I could go on for hours. I often tell people to really understand NOAA's capability, you probably need a PhD in 12 different disciplines. Just from my own personal background and experience, the forecasting, the climate, the weather, the impacts, the observing systems, the planes that fly into the hurricanes to sample the air, all that capability, high-performance computing. It's just a tremendous amount of work. Launching rockets into space with satellites to observe the Earth, it's phenomenal.
And my perspective also was a focus on the maritime missions of NOAA. And for example, as I mentioned in my statement, we know more about the surface of Mars and the Moon than we do the oceans in the world and the oceans in the U.S. We've not even mapped 50% of our exclusive economic zone, and NOAA is continuing the effort we started to do that with the National Ocean Exploration, Mapping, Exploration, and Characterization Strategy and Plan. And that's kind of, there's a part of America that's totally unknown, and that's our oceans. And NOAA is the lead agency in advancing that. And again, if we can make NOAA independent and put NOAA on par with NASA, they'll be able to do more good for all of American citizens.
Thank you all so much. My time has expired.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back, and next we have Representative Mullen from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for your testimony. As you well know, NOAA is a critical player in helping communities prepare for extreme weather events, which are more frequent in my part of the coastal California. We've got atmospheric rivers. We're being buffeted by those. Routinely, I hail from San Mateo County. We've got ocean on one side. We've got the San Francisco Bay on the other. So sea level rise is a crucial concern. Just my county alone has the most property value at risk in the tens of billions of dollars. So my question is simply specific to sea level rise, how an independent NOAA would better address these huge challenges we have around climate generally, but specific to sea level rise and some natural solutions that we need to execute to deal with that challenge. And open for anybody who wants a shot at that, but how would that better position us to deal with this, the enormity of the challenge?
I think really the scientists in NOAA are doing a phenomenal job with analyzing that. Of course, there's a range of scenarios, and there's some uncertainty around that. And I think pinning down what the risk is. We know it's rising. We just don't know by how much. But you have a window of probability that you need to be prepared for. In almost any scenario, it's going to be problematic. So people are going to have to start planning about what to do. So the best thing that NOAA can do. And you know, I think as an independent agency, there's nothing that's going to slow this down. Is them actually putting this information out there, getting the data out there in the public domain, and having folks from the other, you know, like reinsurance companies, disaster preparedness folks, access to that data, and then understand how to properly interpret it. It's incredibly important, and particularly for your district. I mean, there's a lot of work going on at Scripps with the Center for Weather, Water Extremes. Atmospheric rivers are a huge issue out there, obviously, and there's a lot of stuff that they would be doing, particularly with that. And I think as we go forward and we see these more extreme events, that capability is going to be growing in importance.
Yes, I'll second what Dr. Jacobs said. For example, NOAA has a partnership with Scripps Institution of Oceanography, my alma mater, and to do research on atmospheric rivers in order to improve our ability to predict them and their impacts. So making NOAA independent will only allow that kind of work, as mentioned previously, and other work to occur more efficiently, to not be at risk for budget cuts from the department, and therefore serve your citizens.
Yeah, let me add just another dimension to this. Having watched the atmospheric rivers this year, and from my home in Menlo Park, and putting sandbags in front of the garage door, and then looking at our phones to see how far has that level come up in the stream that goes by the house area, and looking at the rest of the neighborhood. I'm very, very, very sensitive to this, and what's missing here is we've told you all the things that we can do and are doing, but there's not enough funding to really take care of the levels we're talking about. The country doesn't understand what the importance of our planet and the water, the 70% it's ocean. We need to work on all of those things, and the public has to understand it's not a partisan issue. This is a large a large brain, two mammal problem to deal with, and believe me, I'm there. We want to do that, and NOAA has of things like this to do, and this much money to do it. Okay, so there needs to be more understanding from the public and the people of just what our planet's doing, and the things we can do if we're properly set up to do it.
Certainly second that sentiment. Thank you all. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and next we have Representative Frost from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this hearing. NOAA was established in the 1970s to understand and predict changes in the climate, weather, ocean, and coast, to share that knowledge and information with others, and to conserve and manage coastal and marine ecosystems and resources. Very important to me, as I am from the great state of Florida. The last part of NOAA's mission statement, to conserve our marine ecosystems, has never been more important. Ocean temperatures rising, causing coral bleaching and the loss of entire ecosystems. Higher temperatures that are also forcing and causing fish to migrate away from their normal habitats. And those temperatures are also making the ocean more acidic, challenging species up and down the food chain. At the same time, while NOAA has had great success in managing our fisheries under many pressures, we're starting to see a rise in fish stocks that are overfished. And while we are facing these issues, I do not see much about the conversation in this draft legislation, and that's concerning to me. In your testimony today, Dr. Lautenbacher, you had brought up the Northwestern Hawaii Islands Marine Conservation Area and the fight against ocean acidification. I consider such accomplishment central to the functions of NOAA, and would love to give you an opportunity to highlight some of the other conservation wins at your time at NOAA.
Yeah, I think conservation is very important. We have to, as I said before, we have to understand where we live and what's around us, and we can't ignore that. We're not smart enough to ignore it. I mean, we need to be able to deliver the kinds of support, if you want to call it that, and understanding to deal with the problems, rather than to kiss them off and say, well, I'll take care of that next week, or I got more important, I want to get my new car out and all that. I mean, there's not enough understanding of what we need to do to continue the way we want to live as the public sector, as real people. So I'm all supportive of trying to deal with that kind of and I think that the more that we can collectively in this audience pass the words on that I've heard from everybody here, I think that will help get the public to understand. We need more public understanding of the positions that we're in today, but we are taking a lot. We are doing almost everything we can with the money that's there inside of NOAA today to do our best. And you've heard these two gentlemen who have been working, right now at it. I'm retired from it, but that's what needs to be done.
No, 100%. And looking at NOAA's fisheries 2023 priorities, I saw projects like restocking salmon off of Maine, reef conservation in the great state of Florida, and developing new strains of oysters especially suited for Alaska. Dr. Gallaudet, you support transferring NOAA's protected species responsibilities to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm worried about the possibility of important conservation projects being lost in such a transition. If Congress approved that, how could we ensure that it's done in a way that keeps NOAA's many long-term conservation projects active and on track?
Thank you for your question, Congressman. First of all, the percent of species that NOAA manages compared to all those in the U.S. is 10%, so it's a small amount. And by virtue of law, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, for example, that it will not slip by because oversight will ensure it won't. So the agency, and we're not even asking for NOAA to not do it, we're asking for that part of the agency to move. So the fine people who are doing that will still continue to do their mission, just organized under a structure that will make the job more efficient with less overhead. But it's important to know that NOAA has done has a great track record in ocean conservation over the last few years. Just under our watch, for example, we expanded the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary. We established the Mission Iconic Reefs in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. We helped start a new sanctuary in Lake Michigan off Wisconsin, and we started the ball rolling on a new one that will be in Lake Ontario, probably approved next year. In addition to the coral reef conservation program advances and a new strategy to address stony coral tissue loss disease in your great state, a big effort that we initiated and is continuing now. So the conservation wins at NOAA are many, and I don't see this bill interfering with any of them.
Gotcha. Thank you so much for the witnesses and their time and your service at NOAA. This is no slight to you three gentlemen, but I also hope in future hearings on this subject we'll also be able to hear from other stakeholder groups and members of the scientific community. Many questions that still need to be answered. Thank you. I yield back.
The member yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Representative Tunko, for 5 minutes.
Hey, thank you, Chair. And thank you, Chair Lucas and Ranking Member Lofgren, for hosting this important hearing. And thank you to our witnesses for their contributions. As an engineer, I've always looked to science to inform the work that I do and to shape our choices as policymakers and public servants. NOAA is indeed a critical piece of our nation's scientific leadership. The data that its expert staff of scientists, engineers, and forecasters provides benefit Americans every day. That is why it is concerning that we have seen a few unfortunate instances where political officials intervened with NOAA's scientific authority. In June of 2020, I called for an investigation into the so-called Sharpiegate, the incident to assess whether administration officials interfered with public emergency notifications that were very much intended to relay critical, science-driven hurricane projections. I've continued to advocate for strong scientific integrity standards and protections at our federal agencies through my Scientific Integrity Act, and I'm happy to see that the Chair's Organic Act legislation promotes the culture of scientific excellence at NOAA that our entire nation and certainly our economy benefit from. So to any of our witnesses, or to all of them, can you all please speak a bit to the importance of scientific integrity at NOAA, and why is it so important that the administration's work products remain free of undue political influence?
I couldn't agree more. I'm really supportive of that legislation. I experienced this firsthand myself. And as a result, I mean, this is one of the things that I can tell you right now, this wouldn't have happened with an independent NOAA. The challenge, and particularly after reviewing a lot of the IG investigation, we went back, we rewrote a lot of the scientific integrity policy, particularly in how it pertains to social media and other stuff. I think it's the gold standard of government science agencies as far as a policy, but it has one fatal flaw, and that's it's not enforceable upwards. It's only enforceable downwards. And NOAA, no matter how great the policy is and how important it is, other than whistleblower protections, there's nothing to prevent this other than possibly an independent agency. And so my concern, no matter where NOAA ends up as far as the Organic Act, this is still an issue that needs to be addressed. And I think it's critical that it gets addressed.
Thank you.
And I agree wholeheartedly, Congressman.
Thank you.
Me too, absolutely. Everything that you heard is right there with me too.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. And how can a NOAA Organic Act strengthen scientific integrity policy and ensure meddling or breaking of such rules does not occur in the future?
Well, I think the policy itself is great, and it stops at the top. And if NOAA is an independent agency, then the policy basically covers the entire agency, which is that's the way it should work. The challenge is right now, like I said, it's not enforceable upward. Department of Commerce doesn't have one that matches with any of NOAA's policies or equities. It's very different, and there's no real go-between. And that to me is a gap, and I think an independent agency would be more protected from that type of outside interference.
Thank you. Gentlemen, any other thoughts?
Yes, Congressman. I think scientific integrity is essentially about leadership, especially at NOAA, and ensuring an administrator can exercise leadership and in scientific integrity in that way will be more effective if not having to report to the Department of Commerce.
Thank you.
Totally agree again. It's integrity, and it starts at the top, and the top of NOAA should be doing the same thing, and they are. So let's allow it to happen.
Thank you very much for your info. I look forward to continuing to work with you all to promote scientific integrity at NOAA, and I do indeed remain grateful to the chair for highlighting this important issue in his legislation. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now turns to the gentleman from Illinois to most likely conclude our hearing. Mr. Caston's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Most likely, it makes me wonder what the alternative is, but I'll do my best. I want to start just by really thanking all of you for your service. NOAA's a wonderful organization. You're exceptional public servants, and I think we're fortunate to have had you in those chairs. And I say that because so often as somebody who ran for office on 3 issues, climate change, and climate change, I've depended on NOAA analysis to explain what's going on. There was this report last week. I was pulling through just a handful of things that we've been saying recently. NOAA tide gauge data that says that sea levels in Louisiana today are 8 inches higher than they were in 2006 when Katrina hit. A NOAA analysis from last year that said we can expect 2 feet of sea level rise on the Gulf Coast by 2050 relative to today. The information about recent hurricanes being, much accelerated because of the rising temperatures, in the Gulf and elsewhere, and what that means. And we would not have that data for us in our job to make informed policy without the good work that NOAA has done. Seen from one angle, that's just facts presented by dispassionate scientists collecting, dispassionately collecting data. But it is impossible to decouple that from the politics. And, whether that's, what accountability does an elected official have who was previously denying that climate change was real or blocking things that would change climate change? How responsible is that person for this storm? That's not a scientific question, that's a political question. Did a elected official do enough to, knowing the data that was available from NOAA and others, to prepare people and evacuate people? That's a political question, not a scientific question. And what I'm struck by is that, Dr. Lautenbacher, I think you probably experienced both of those firsthand in Katrina. Were the senior officials responsible, and did they do enough to get people out of the way? But if I recall, you didn't get your name dragged into the public eye to the way that, say, Director Brown at FEMA did.
No, that's true. You're right.
Dr. Jacobs, I think during Sharpiegate, you got dragged into that in a much different way. And this hearing is about, the independence of NOAA as an agency. But I wonder if you'd get philosophical with me a little bit about your independence as an administrator. And I guess my first question for you, Dr. Jacobs, is: do you agree that the job of administrator at NOAA, because of climate change, is becoming more political?
Yes, I do, and I think it's probably going to become more political, not just because of climate change, but a lot of other things going forward. I mean, you have all these weather events, severe weather events, which are exacerbated by climate change. I mean, it's all, yeah, I totally agree.
So I guess I asked that, and you and I talked about this a bit a year or two ago. Do you think that the training you had prior to becoming a NOAA administrator prepared you for the sudden political challenges you found yourself under during Sharpiegate? I mean, if you were to go back and knowing the job you would end up with, were there some other courses you would have taken in college?
I don't think they offer those courses. No, I mean, I wasn't prepared for that. My formal training is a scientist. Yeah. And I felt like, I was one of the scientists in a horrible situation. And I think what a lot of people probably don't understand about NOAA is it's in the Department of Commerce. Department of Commerce can overrule any decision that even the NOAA administrator wants.
Yeah. So I guess, and just with the remainder of the time, and it's unfair to ask you to do this in a minute, but the Fed is independent. The Fed is independent by funding, they are independent by administration. The chair of the Fed is not immune to pressure from the president if the president wants rates to go in a different direction. The CFTC is appointed and approved by the Senate, so not as independent as the Fed, but their funding is independent, and they are not immune from pressures. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is totally independent, and yet they've been short-staffed for the last several months because the appointment has become politicized of FERC chairs. And so as you think about what a independent NOAA means, setting aside the legislation we're talking about today, in your view, is this a need for the funding source? Is it a need for how the heads are appointed? Is it a need for how they're trained and what we search for? Because they're different suites of questions, and I can find lots of administrators of agencies who are nominally independent but suffer from under political pressure.
I think, I mean, maybe my perspective might not be unique to the Department of Commerce. This is quite possible this happens in other administrations or other departments, but I think one of the challenges of having Senate-confirmed political appointees in bureaus or departments that then have to answer to Schedule C political staff who are not Senate-confirmed or anything at a higher department level, they feel like the people under them answer to them. And I feel like if you're just going at a Senate-confirmed political level, you could figure this out in a more coherent way. But I feel like there's layers of these Schedule C political staffers that really exert a lot more authority than they should have. And maybe it's delegated to them, maybe that's just what they think, I don't know. But to me, that seems like something that you wouldn't see if NOAA was independent.
I'm way over time,
Gentlemen?
but I would love to continue the conversation, and I will yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. I can assure the gentleman that the conversation will continue and that I see a number of points in the conversation today where there is a lot of agreement within this full committee, and we will make progress. With that, I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The record will remain open for 10 days for additional comments and written questions from the members. This hearing is adjourned.